For decades, whispers echoed through the royal corridors rumors of a secret document, a final command from Queen Elizabeth herself, a document that, if revealed, would alter the future of the monarchy and shatter Camilla's ambitions. Now, with the emergence of long-suppressed papers, Princess Anne stands vindicated, and Prince George is catapulted into royal destiny. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with silence. Princess Anne, often overlooked and rarely courted by the media frenzy surrounding other royals, had for years been the quiet backbone of duty and discipline. But after Queen Elizabeth's death, her demeanor shifted subtly. Her movements sharpened, and her schedule became irregular. Documents, previously locked away under royal order, had been unsealed. Not to the family at large, but to one person, Anne. Within them, a startling revelation. Personal holdings in Scotland, Balmoral, Birkhall, Delnadampf were not designated to the current monarch as expected. Instead, there were deliberate omissions, suspicious absences of Charles's name, and an envelope addressed cryptically, "Private Eyes Only." AS, that single set of initials sent shivers through the hierarchy. The monarchy had always operated under layers of secrecy, and succession was no exception. But whispers among staff suggested that Queen Elizabeth had long debated her Scottish legacy not merely in political terms, but in symbolic ones. Scotland was her sanctuary, her spiritual retreat, her ancestral bloodline. And when she looked to the future, she didn't see Camilla, nor even Charles, as the steward of that legacy. She saw the child who would carry the monarchy into the next century, Prince George. It wasn't just preference, it was protection. And Princess Anne, ever the loyal guardian, knew exactly what was at stake. Her visits to Balmoral, once routine and unpublicized, now drew subtle attention. She stayed longer, she made inquiries. She spoke to the legal custodians of the estates in tones that were firm and final. Something had changed, and those paying attention began to sense it. The air around Anne grew heavier with purpose. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted too. Private meetings were suddenly rescheduled. Certain members of staff, particularly those aligned with Camilla, found themselves sidelined. And the more Anne investigated, the more tension began to crackle between royal factions. No one quite knew when the Queen's private will had been drawn up or how far its implications reached. But one thing was certain, Anne was not chasing shadows. She was following instructions, and in doing so, she was drawing closer and closer to a truth that could not only fracture the existing power structure, but rebuild it entirely around George. Her loyalty, long dismissed as stiff tradition, now emerged as the single greatest threat to Camilla's long-game influence, and perhaps the final safeguard for the Queen's true wishes. But what exactly was in those sealed documents, and why were they kept hidden from Charles, Camilla, and even William? The answer would stun the monarchy at its core. Buried deep within the Queen's personal testament was a clause never meant for public eyes. It named one heir to all Scottish holdings, not the monarch, not the consort, but a child, a symbol of the future. Prince George. And only one royal had the resolve to uphold this truth, Princess Anne. What Anne uncovered wasn't just a technicality, it was a bombshell. Inside the Queen's private directives, locked away from official channels and Crown Estate registrars, was a clause unlike any other. It bore the Queen's unmistakable handwriting, her signature deliberate and final. It bypassed the established succession norms and named, in unambiguous terms, Prince George as the sole heir to the monarch's personal properties in Scotland. It was a staggering move. The language was purposeful, even poetic. "To my beloved great-grandson George, in whom I see the true spirit of legacy, I entrust the lands of Scotland, not merely for inheritance, but for guardianship." This was no ordinary bequeathment. It was a passing of purpose, a torch lit for the next generation, igniting a firestorm among those who believed the Queen's will ended with her breath. Anne wasn't supposed to see it. The clause had been hidden in a collection of personal writings, unindexed and unreferenced in the official will. But through what palace insiders describe as a combination of intuition and intervention, Anne gained limited access to these writings under the guise of organizing posthumous tributes. What she found was a directive that challenged everything Camilla had positioned herself to control. Not only were Charles and Camilla completely excluded from any mention of the Queen's Scottish properties, but there were also clear indications the Queen deliberately separated these holdings from the monarchy's institutional crown. They were her own, and she chose their next custodian without hesitation. Once Camilla's aides caught wind of Anne's access, efforts were swiftly made to bury the clause. Lawyers loyal to Camilla argued it held no constitutional weight, that the Queen's wishes outside the Crown estate structure were merely symbolic. But Anne was not interested in legal loopholes. She was fighting for principle, for the truth of what the Queen wanted, not what the throne demanded. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Camilla's advisors moved to isolate Anne's findings, attempting to question the clause's authenticity, even going so far as to challenge the handwriting. But those efforts only emboldened Anne further. If anything, they proved she was walking directly toward the heart of something the palace desperately wanted hidden. And as Anne began to push back against palace resistance, a quiet war erupted behind Balmoral's iron gates. When Camilla caught wind of Anne's discovery, her fury was swift and unrelenting. Staff were reassigned, travel permissions revoked, and Anne's inner circle came under surveillance. What began as a dispute over inheritance spiraled into a silent war between the Queen's only daughter and the woman now wearing her crown. It didn't take long for the clash to turn cold and calculated. Anne had quietly exposed a truth that threatened to undermine Camilla's carefully crafted ascent to power. Behind the palace walls, their once cordial distance turned venomous. According to several close aides, Camilla confronted Anne in a closed-door meeting so volatile that staff outside heard raised voices. Camilla allegedly accused her of playing queenmaker and warned that any further meddling in succession affairs would be seen as insubordination, not family loyalty. Anne, unwavering, responded not with retaliation but with silence, an icy defiance that said more than words ever could. But Camilla was not content with silence, she wanted obedience. Almost overnight, shifts within the royal household hinted that a silent purge was underway. Long-serving staff at Balmoral were mysteriously let go. Locks were changed, rooms were sealed off. Those loyal to Anne found themselves relocated or removed altogether. Even Anne's private assistant, someone who had served her since her early equestrian days, was barred from the Balmoral estate without explanation. Then came the digital surveillance. Private security footage, usually accessible only to the King's personal security liaison, was reviewed by Camilla's aides. They were hunting for evidence. Proof of who had handled the documents, who had shared them, who stood to gain from the exposure of the Queen's clause. Anne's access to certain archival sections was suddenly revoked, under the pretext of rotational security audits. It was a thin veil, and she knew it. For the first time in her royal life, Anne felt the full force of modern palace politics aimed directly at her. No swords, no public outbursts, just quiet, clinical isolation. There were whispers of veiled threats, subtle enough to be denied but pointed enough to chill even the most hardened royal. One note, left anonymously in Anne's correspondence tray, read simply, "Not everything belongs to the past." It was a message, and it was personal. She went quiet, but not because she was afraid. She was ting. Inside the palace, more disturbing questions began to surface. Had Camilla told Charles everything? Sources suggest she hadn't. That she had, in fact, delayed informing the king about the clause for weeks, perhaps hoping to discredit or contain it before he ever laid eyes on it. While Charles remained publicly unaware, a private storm brewed beneath his crown. A storm Anne was preparing to unleash not with rage but with alliances. But Camilla underestimated Anne's resolve and the explosive allies waiting in the wings. In a rare display of royal unity, Prince William privately aligned himself with Princess Anne, choosing legacy over protocol and truth over silence. Together they formed a quiet alliance to protect George's inheritance and expose the truth the monarchy feared most. The turning point came quietly but powerfully. William, already burdened with the looming weight of the crown, stumbled upon a series of discrepancies in the legal filings concerning Balmoral and other Scottish holdings. They didn't match the conversations he'd been having with palace accountants, nor did they reflect the public-facing summaries handed to the press. Something was off, buried, altered, or perhaps hidden altogether. When Anne approached him with excerpts from the Queen's sealed directives, everything snapped into place. William read the lines in stunned silence, particularly the Queen's handwritten note declaring George as the rightful heir to the Scottish legacy. He was shaken not by the clause itself, but by the realization that no one had told him. Not his father, not the courtiers, not even the legal teams. What Anne gave him wasn't just a copy, it was a cry for action. William, always cautious, had never stepped out of line publicly. But this time, duty overrode diplomacy. In a moment palace insiders would later describe as tense and devastating, William confronted Charles directly. Behind closed doors, the confrontation was said to have rattled the king to his core. Sources claimed Charles uttered only 5 words, "I had no idea, William." And for once, that wasn't a deflection, it was the truth. Charles had been kept in the dark, manipulated into silence while others maneuvered behind his back. With the veil lifted, Anne and William moved swiftly. They approached the Queen's personal notary, a man who had remained silent out of fear and loyalty, and demanded confirmation. Under Anne's unflinching gaze and William's authority, the notary broke. He confirmed it all. The clause was real. The Queen's intentions were clear. George was her chosen heir to Scotland, not as a formality, but as a safeguard for the future. That truth could no longer be suppressed. William then instructed palace legal teams to begin a discreet but comprehensive audit of all Scottish holdings tied to the Queen's personal estate. He wasn't just securing properties, he was securing legacy. This was about more than land. It was about honouring the one person who had guided the monarchy for over 7 decades and protecting the one child in whom she placed her final hope. And through it all, Anne stood beside him not as an aunt, not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a co-architect of truth. For the first time in living memory, the monarchy's generational lines blurred. Anne, the Queen's daughter, and William, the future king, formed an unspoken pact. The future would no longer be dictated by titles alone, but by intention, loyalty, and legacy. It was a quiet revolution, and together they lit the path forward. But as George's destiny was being secured, a wave of backlash loomed, especially from those who had everything to lose. A father, a king, a man at war with himself. Charles found himself in an impossible position, torn between honouring his late mother's dying wish and standing beside his wife, Camilla, whose influence had grown dangerously absolute. The decision he would make next would ripple across generations. When Charles was finally shown the Queen's clause, it felt like a betrayal, but not of the crown, of him. In his mind, he had always assumed the stewardship of Scotland would pass to him without question, but his mother's final words had bypassed him completely. He wasn't mentioned, not once. The Queen had made her choice, and it was not her son, it was her great-grandson. The silence in the document cut deeper than any words possibly could. According to palace insiders, Charles wept during a private meeting with Anne and William, and in a moment of raw emotion he whispered something no one had expected to hear. It was always hers to give. That admission changed everything. It wasn't anger that consumed him, it was grief. Not just for his mother, but for the illusion of control he thought he still had. But grief offered no sanctuary. Camilla, infuriated by the clause's exposure and the growing support behind it, demanded action. She called it a humiliation, a strategic oversight that needed immediate correction. She urged Charles to challenge the will, to assert his rights as king, to remind Anne and William, who wore the own. But Charles hesitated. He wasn't ready to defy the last wish of the woman who had defined his life and perhaps ruled more effectively from the shadows than he ever had from the throne. Camilla's pressure mounted. What began as persuasion turned to confrontation. Reports emerged of shouting matches behind closed doors, of Charles retreating to Highgrove alone for nights at a time, unwilling to face the weight of the decision or the consequences of standing still. The situation grew dire enough that a family council was convened. Charles, Anne, William, and select advisors gathered in a closed-door session meant to chart a unified path forward. But no statement came. No resolution was announced. Charles refused to make a public declaration. He said only that the matter was deeply personal and deserving of quiet reflection. But in the absence of clarity, the tension only worsened. The monarchy had fractured, divided between those upholding the Queen's last words and those fighting to rewrite them. And at the heart of it all was a man torn between the mother he'd buried and the wife he now feared losing. It was a moment where inaction spoke volumes. The king stood still, frozen in conflict, while the storm swirled around him, but the vacuum left by his silence wouldn't last long. Because while Charles wavered, unsure of which path to take, Princess Anne made a move that would seal her legacy and silence all doubt. With palace whispers turning into national speculation, Princess Anne stepped into the spotlight. In a televised statement that stunned the world, she confirmed the Queen's final wishes and named George as the exclusive heir to Scotland's personal royal probe. Aughties! The nation gasped, and Camilla's silence spoke louder than words. It was a moment decades in the making. With the monarchy veiled in confusion and internal warfare, the public demanded clarity, and Princess Anne, never one to chase cameras or indulge in sentiment, rose to meet the moment with quiet, unwavering conviction. Standing before the gates of Balmoral, the estate she had fought to protect, she addressed the world not as a rebel or a royal agitator, but as the last guardian of the Queen's private truth. Her voice, steady with emotion yet resolute in purpose, pierced through the fog of palace secrecy. She spoke of her mother's bond with Scotland, of the Queen's deep belief that George, not the throne, should inherit its spirit. My mother believed that to protect Scotland, she said, we must entrust it to the future. That future is George. There were no apologies, no political calculus, only truth. The Queen's private clause, once rumoured and buried in doubt, was displayed in full view. Royal archivists authenticated it, matching ink samples, verifying seals, cross-referencing with the Queen's known handwriting. There was no longer any room for doubt. The words were hers. The intent was unmistakable. The public, gripped by this unfolding drama, turned their gaze to the gates of Scottish royal estates. Crowds gathered, laying flowers and banners with messages of support. Thank you, Anne. For Scotland, for the Queen, for George. Something seismic had shifted not just within the royal family, but in the people's hearts. Anne had done what no one else dared. She brought light to a truth the monarchy had tried to contain. Camilla, whose presence had dominated the royal stage for months, vanished. She declined 3 consecutive public appearances, citing health reasons. But insiders knew better. This was not a matter of scheduling, it was strategy. Her silence was not protective, it was damning. While Anne was being hailed as the keeper of the Queen's legacy, Camilla became the face of everything the public feared about modern monarchy: manipulation, ambition, and the erasure of tradition. In press circles, commentators referred to Anne's announcement as the single most decisive moment of her royal life. For a woman once cast in the background, this was her coronation of truth, and for George, it was the quiet start of a destiny he never asked for but could no longer escape. But as the dust settled around the Scottish Highlands, a deeper question emerged. What did this mean for George's future role in the monarchy? He may be a child to the world, but within palace walls, Prince George now carries the weight of a nation's legacy. The crown may still rest on Charles's head, but the soul of Scotland now beats in George's future, and the path ahead is anything but certain. It began with a conversation no child should be expected to carry. In a private room, away from the fanfare and tension gripping the monarchy, William and Anne sat down with George to explain what had unfolded, not in cold legalese or regal detachment, but with the gravity it deserved. They told him of the Queen's wishes, of her hand-written words, of the lands in Scotland she entrusted to him. George listened in silence. And then, as one palace aide later revealed, he looked up and softly asked, "But what about Grandad?" A question that captured the heartbreak of inheritance, where gain comes with grief, and honor walks hand in hand with burden. Behind the scenes, royal advisors quickly realized that this wasn't merely a sentimental moment, it was a political turning point. Scotland's symbolic link to the monarchy had always been precarious, and now, with George as its future steward, the stakes had risen. Advisors began mapping out a plan to gradually ease him into public roles connected to the Scottish estates. Talks surfaced about introducing a new Scottish title for George, one that wouldn't challenge the crown directly but would root him publicly in the land the Queen had once called her sanctuary. But these moves weren't just about optics, they were about defense. Legal teams, working under William's instruction, drafted new protections around the Queen's clause, ensuring that no future reinterpretation could challenge George's inheritance. The clause was fortified, and any attempt to undermine it would face immediate legal scrutiny. That move, however, didn't go unanswered. Whispers emerged from within Camilla's extended circle, suggestions that her grandchildren or bloodline should be considered for stewardship, if not ownership, of auxiliary Scottish holdings. A formal counterclaim was allegedly prepared, but before it could be filed, it was dismissed by the Royal Legal Committee in its entirety. The decision was final. Scotland, as defined by the Queen's last wish, belonged to George. Public sentiment surged in George's favour. Polls showed a sharp increase in support for him, not as a future monarch, but as a bridge between the crown and the people. Where Charles struggled with acceptance, and William was viewed as dutiful but distant, George emerged as a blank slate, untainted, hopeful, and now chosen. For many, he represented renewal, the first breath of something that felt both sacred and new. But with that rising hope came a rising responsibility. And for a boy still learning the shape of his future, it was a destiny laid heavy with expectation. Yet the story doesn't end here, because buried within the Queen's documents was one final twist no one could have expected. Tucked behind the clause, folded in aged parchment, was a handwritten letter from Queen Elizabeth, not to Charles, not to William, but to her daughter Anne. A final goodbye, a final affirmation, and with it the validation Anne had waited her entire life to receive. The letter had been sealed with wax, bearing the Queen's personal insignia, and marked in a way only Anne would recognize. It was not meant for archival. It was not meant for history. It was meant for the woman who had walked beside her in silence, in strength, and in solitude. Addressed simply, "To my constant companion and fiercest shield," the Queen's words poured from the page with a clarity that no public proclamation could match. She thanked Anne not just for her service, but for her sacrifices, for being the daughter who never asked for spotlight, who never demanded recognition, but who carried the burdens others couldn't see. The Queen wrote, "You alone understood what duty means beyond the crown. You were never meant to rule. And yet you ruled over duty with more grace than any sovereign could." It was the kind of praise Anne had never received in life, but now, in death, the Queen had offered it without restraint. The letter didn't just comfort, it confirmed. The Queen explained her decision to entrust Scotland to George, but she named Anne as its guardian, not in title but in spirit. It was Anne's task to guide, to protect, and to ensure that the lands she so loved would never become tokens of political gain. "I have watched you all my life, Annie," the Queen wrote, "and I have seen in you the fire I once had, the fire to do what is right, not what is easy." She acknowledged the resistance Anne would face, the backlash, the loneliness, and yet she made it clear that no one else could carry this torch. Those who witnessed Anne reading the letter said she did so alone, seated at Balmoral, in the very place the Queen had spent her final summer. She wept not from pain but from release. For years she had endured being overlooked, sidelined, even questioned. And now, in these final words, she was seen. Completely. The last line of the Queen's letter was written with trembling ink, but its message rang like a bell. "You have always been my true north." A phrase that not only honoured Anne's unshakable compass but crowned her, in a way no coronation ever could. And so, while the crown may pass from head to head, it is hearts like Anne's that preserve the soul of the monarchy. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.